because the Norwegian, well, he has some surface intelligence. He's not really a character of depth as pertains to the fact that he has no ethical compass or any kind of real depth. So,
Well, the Norwegian is someone who would probably be a sciolist. He thinks more of himself than he really is. He's certainly intelligent in terms of knowing facts. He's certainly clever in getting away with things, but he's not. This is not the Norwegian that we see a decade later in the Vincetti brothers. This is the Norwegian coming into his own, and we find out, just to talk about real life thing, one of the most famous murders of all time was the murder of Alberto Anastasia, the head of Murder Inc., in a barber chair in 1957, I believe, or 58, 59, something like that. And we find out in this book that the real killer is the Norwegian, and that's the thing that made his name. And we later find out, because I have one of the trailers is called Higher Powers, and one of the things that we find out is there are people above the mafia and foundation level in terms of powers, and that's like FBI Director Hoover, Howard Hughes, Carlo Gambino, and one other person I forget but so I'm setting up in here that there are powers beyond this underworld here, and we see that later in my book, The Super Seven, and oh yeah, and George Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, is the fourth of the higher powers, the head of the DAS, Department of American Security, which I introduce here and expand upon later. And when I do my science fiction book set hundreds of years in the future, we're going to see all of these strands coming together. We're also going to see strands of, for example, the Mule and the Foundation going back into my con books, when I do my great con books. So I'm really creating an alternate world universe here, and these are major parts of it. But anyway, yeah. So these little things like the real life murder of Albert Anastasia, uh, I give reasons for.
yeah, it's an interesting technique to connect it to real life events, but also imbue narrative into it. Um, let's talk about one of the chapters. This is a very interesting chapter. It's called "The Softness Behind the Knee," and it
What what
intersperses
what
a lane.
what page is it?
This is page 151. Um, the, and it kind of intersperses Lane Shore's abruptions and
Yeah.
transitions to one thing after another. I think it contains one of the first Tony Luft memories of
Yeah.
his Christmas interaction with Buster Crabbe. And one of the things that's highly enjoyable about these memories is how more ever elaborate they become.
Yeah.
They begin with him just basically seeing Buster Crabbe, and then suddenly he's interacting with Buster Crabbe, and then Buster Crabbe is complimenting him, and it goes on and on from there. That's a good into, not even a tertiary character, but kind of like a
Well, let me just say something before that. There's a good scene here with Paulie talking with the union steward, so we get some of the union
yes,
corruption here, and we're talking about Paulie owns part of the company, but he also has controlling interest in the union, and so he's basically negotiating with himself, and he's trying, and so that's a good scene there. Lido Valverde, the Bakers Union or something, and
it's
then
with Jimmy Hoffa.
yeah, which is another real life character. So we're getting set up, and I don't have Paulie because Paulie would have been dead by the time the real Hoffa ended up dead. So he doesn't have anything to do with that. But we get again a good sense of the influence of Paulie in knowing people and how he deals with people, and his conversation with Hoffa filled with cajoling plus threats and winks and nods is really how a lot of these people reacted. I used to, when I was a union member, I would see some of this stuff with people when we were negotiating union contracts. Anyway, but and then then we get into Tony Luft, and Tony Luft. Well, Tony Luft, is he there? Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, Tony Luft, like Vito Vincetti, uh, in a sense, Tony Luft is a one-dimensional funny guy. There's the scene with his uncle and the dead goldfish in Vincetti Brothers. That's sort of the signature Tony Luft thing. But here, instead of just having doublings like I did in Vincetti Brothers, there's almost an endless loop. And so over every year from 1960 to 67 on Christmas, 8 Christmases, Tony Luft is alone in his shit dingy apartment. He's sitting on a chair or a couch and watching children's Christmas cartoons or something, whether it's Mr. Magoo or Charlie Brown or Rudolph or The Grinch Stole Christmas. He's watching this shit, and he's either jerking off and he falls asleep, and he has this memory. Well, it could be just his total dream. We don't know. When he was a little boy and he was going to meet the 1930s and 40s B action star Buster Crabbe, and his memories become more and more elaborate. And I just recently rewatched, for example, with Jessica last weekend, The King of Comedy, and in a sense, it's a very Rupert Pupkin-like thing. The way his fantasies every Christmas seem to get more and more elaborate.
You would think too that you would lose a lot of characterization in the secondary characters, but by having it such a wide scope, but you intersperse them very well. The Buster Crabbe memories too. It's interesting that you call Norwegian a dark comedy because it has high moments of drama too, even if they are comic at first glance.
Yeah.
The Tony Luft is a good example in that while it is comical scenes and that you laugh at Luft. There's also lots of pathos and depth to the characterization too. Not necessarily Tony Luft himself, but just the characterization of Luft, and you get with this cyclical thing a kind of a great symbol for his life.
Yeah, and Tony Luft has a few other good scenes when he's contracted by the woman who eventually becomes Paulie's wife, and he tries to make a pass at her or something, and then he eventually turns her into Paulie and whatnot. But the keys to Tony Luft is this scene, this cyclical recycling scene, and just like Vito Vincetti, I mean, it's an argument as to who's dumber in this book, Vito or Luft, and if you throw in Gino Vincetti, from the prior book, and it's interesting because the only Vincetti that we see other than Gino, I think, is the oldest brother, not Dino. I think there's a small scene where I think Vito comes by with his oldest son, whose name slips my mind now. He's signing up to be drafted for Vietnam or something, and I think Big Frank tells him he shouldn't volunteer or something. But other than that, there aren't any Vincettis here because I made the idea that the Vincetti, other than Vito Vincetti, any deeper characterizations is all within the Vincetti brothers book, and here Vito is definitely a background character and whatnot.